Hi, I'm Carly.
And I'm Trey with New City Church.
Welcome to our podcast series on faith and mental health.
Each week we will unpack a topic relating to emotional or mental health and walking out a life of faith.
The format will vary slightly from week to week, from teaching, practical advice, conversation, interviews, and practices that we have found helpful in our own lives.
So, let's jump on in.
Hi, we're so glad you're here. We are now on episode 2 of our
Numero dos.
second season of the podcast, which is really exciting.
2-2.
Last week, what we did was kind of a broad overview of mental health and faith and why we think that mental health is even a factor in our lives. And we kind of pointed to some biblical truths in that as well. And this week, what we're going to do is more of a cultural autopsy, which sounds really fancy, but
It is fancy.
it is fancy. I don't know that we're actually qualified to do said autopsy, but we're just going to kind of go over some questions and some thoughts that we have, not being professionals or have
You're very
necessarily
professional, Carly.
research on this, but we are going to talk about just the ways we think that our culture interplays with mental health and some factors that may play into that.
Yeah, for sure. And if you're watching online, we have a spaceman, a Lego spaceman hidden in this video shot somewhere. So look for it, comment below. If you find it, don't ruin it. Don't tell everybody that you found it, but just tell people that you found it.
Yeah. And if you ruin it,
there's
nothing we can do about it. So.
Absolutely nothing, but
Except delete your comment, I guess.
that's true.
Okay, so I'm going to start with some questions and we're just going to have a conversation about this. So my first question I have is, what are some potential cultural barriers when it comes to mental health?
Yeah, I think there are two broad streams when it comes to mental health stuff. One would be some form that is heightened elevation of the self and as far as it pertains to feelings. And so one side would hyper elevate feelings to be the thing that is of utmost value and what is the ultimate source of truth. So one side would be that. Then another side would be some form of new form of stoicism or something where feelings are not really meant to be listened to. We're only meant to listen to rationality or logical thought processes. And so two big cultural barriers when it comes to it is we are facing both of these narratives. One that says your feelings are always to be listened to and not just valued, but be seen as the truth. And another one that says feelings are really best case for a human is to learn to transcend all feelings and not operate in some form of emotional way. And so from a cultural perspective, anytime you talk in mental health, you're facing both of these cultural narratives. One's a little bit more Enlightenment-esque, also maybe if I'm thinking correctly, transhumanist. And then another one is more like I said, more self-expression. And the hard part is both of them have some bits of things that I would agree with and some things that I would very strongly disagree with. And so culturally speaking, anytime you talk about feelings or mental health, you are approaching something that has a lot of conversation and history and philosophy around it. And that's not even to mention the history of psychology and lobotomies and conversations around spirituality and
I love that you just threw in lobotomies.
well, it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what people did.
Oh, yeah.
Not that long ago. So there's a lot of remnants of all of that, which is ironic since they ought to have removed those pieces when they did the lobotomies. That was awful. I'm so sorry.
Oh my. Okay, so the thought that I had, that is not a question that I told you I was going to ask, but do you have a certain bent toward one or the other, or did you grow up with a certain bent towards one or the other?
Yeah, more the stoicism angle of we ought to transcend emotions. Emotions aren't meant to be ultimately, well, when we say ultimately, aren't to be trusted.
Mm-hmm.
would have been the thing. And so if I felt something and it didn't line up with so-called facts, I would not only like not count it as truth, but I would like outright dismiss it or suppress it or push it away. Or if it was just a purely emotional experience, then somehow that meant that it was less than a purely rational experience, as if those are just these binaries that you can operate only within one or the other. So like, yeah, if one side says trust your heart and the other side says don't trust your heart or don't trust your feelings, I probably operated more towards the don't trust your feelings, which was very difficult as someone who struggled with depression like my whole life. So
It's just very difficult in general when you have
Sure.
feelings and you're taught not to trust your feelings. So,
sure.
or that's just
Yeah.
kind of how you think about it. Yeah,
What about you?
I am the same. I was definitely of this mindset of like, don't trust your feelings. Those aren't actual indicators. Like, rationality says thought only. Rationality says like discount this. And so for me, my adult journey has been trying to learn how to reconnect those things because I got really good at just being like, the feelings aren't part of this. So yeah, I think the point is that it should be both. Like,
Yeah.
they're indicators to us. They're there for a reason. We weren't just given feelings. As we talked about in our last season, like Jesus also experienced feelings. So if it were meant to be that feelings were just imperfect and we're not supposed to trust them, then he wouldn't have also felt the things that we feel.
Yeah.
So,
I think it was in Tyler Staton's book, Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools. He was talking about emotions and saying that when we talk about emotions, we're not saying that every emotion that you feel is like true and good and right, but that there is a true and good and right way to experience said emotions. Like every emotion, there's a way to experience it.
yeah. So, the question again was, what are some potential cultural barriers when it comes to mental health? And so, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about just this epidemic of loneliness that we now have. And like, have we developed like deep, true friendships that of people we can turn to when things are tough or good or all the in between? Another barrier I was thinking of is just access to mental health professionals because it's expensive
It's
and
so expensive.
often health insurance does not cover anything to do with that. And so that is obviously another barrier for when you're trying to seek help.
And depending on what type of help, right? Like if it's a therapist versus a like psychiatrist, or like if you are in need of medication or whatever, and you go to your general care provider, that's not their field of expertise. And so I remember for me, when I needed to see a psychiatrist after going to a therapist, my therapist recommended I see my general care provider. So I did. And then my general care provider prescribed me stuff, made everything awful after they bumped up the dose. And I was like, luckily I like had studied psychology in undergrad, and like I knew enough about the way that those medications work that I was like, I think this is having one of those negative effects.
Yeah.
And so he's like, okay, I will refer you, which is smart of him. He's like, I'll refer you to a psychiatrist. But even with the referral to a new psychiatrist from a general care provider, it took months to get in to see them. Meanwhile, you're on those medications.
Yeah.
And that is with somebody with resources and knowledge around the things.
Yeah.
So it's notoriously very difficult to get in to see like a psychiatrist.
Yeah, and I just don't think there's like a general consensus on that particular facet of health, your mental health, like what each doctor will choose to do.
It's somewhat trial and
or-
error because it's it can be a conglomerate of a number of different things. That's not my field of expertise, but it's a conglomerate of a lot of stuff. And that's the culture barrier too, right? Like as you're saying, like it's loneliness, it's access to care, it's technology affects it. It's like it's not just one thing. It's this like perfect storm of a ton of different things. COVID, and
Yeah.
it's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
News cycles, like
Yeah. Some other things I had were stigma. There's still stigma, especially among different age groups, and honestly, just the way you were raised or taught to think about mental health. I think self-reflection and introspection isn't really something that we value as a culture, and that's a huge part of mental health is trying to figure out just the layers that make us up as a human, and some things have been done to you that need to be unpacked, and some things that you're perpetuating that need to be unpacked. That second part in particular is really, really not valued as our culture would say. And so if you just operate out of the pain and the woundedness, then like you're probably going to accidentally perpetuate that pain and woundedness in ways that you never meant to. I think in a lot of ways. Obviously that's not a one size fits all, but then kind of like this polarization or us versus them mentality that we have as a culture, I was thinking really oversimplifying complexities in life, and then kind of along with that, the social pressure to really believe, think, view through one type of lens or else kind of mentality.
Yeah.
I think are also some cultural barriers that we have. So,
Yeah. Also instant gratification
yeah.
too. Like we are so formed into wanting everything immediately. And by that I mean like literally from the time that we are young, and increasingly so. You want to watch something on TV about, I don't know, a cartoon with the bear in it. Like you just Google cartoon with bear, you can find it and watch many episodes right now. If you have a question, you don't have to sit in the uncertainty of it. You go to Google. If you want to listen to music, you don't have to go to the store and buy a CD or go find somebody who plays that type of music or learn the song yourself. You go and you look it up on Spotify. And there's a lot of good stuff that comes out of that. But like math, you don't have to do it yourself as much now. Like you can just type it in a calculator. And so all of that, when it comes to not very uncomfortable experiences, that we are uncomfortable sitting in the waiting or the not knowing or the anticipation of, like when the loading screen's still going, how much more so when we are in a really deep throw of depression or having a panic attack or walking through an immense season of grief, do then we also want immediate gratification, immediate out, when it is something far more uncomfortable than waiting for a loading screen.
Yeah.
When quite literally, I mean, go to a doctor's office and people are waiting. What do? They all have their phone. We all have our phones out. And if you pay attention and you put your phone away, you will notice. And so that's a cultural barrier too, because we're so formed in not big deal situations to not wait, that when it's something that takes an immense amount of time and not always easy answers and pain and going through uncomfort to get out, and it recycling at different times when you thought you were done, that makes it really, really hard.
Yeah. I was just thinking about the other day, I went to Target and then I went to the grocery store, and both times I went and waited for the person to scan all of my items, and I was intentionally trying to be like, okay, you're not in a rush, like be patient with these people. But I was so antsy. I was so like, I'm trying, face-to-face interaction, and these people, I was trying so hard, and even then I was like, I'm having a really hard time waiting for this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So moving on to another question, what are some generational differences you've noticed in approaching mental health?
Great question. I just had a light bulb go off in my head. So I'm gonna share. James 1
Bing.
talks about let every count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you encounter trials of various kinds, for you know the testing of your faith produces steadfastness or endurance. And let that have its full effect, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. This impatience that we've been formed in has a very negative detriment to us and how we experience and operate within mental health. And one of the positive side effects of dealing with the more chronic mental health, grief, anxiety, depression, is that it helps give you some grit and some like forced patience, because you couldn't force your way out of it. So anyways, that went off in my head. Generational differences. I think it depends on how far back we we go. I mean, if you were to go back to like, once again, this is not my field of expertise here, but go back to like Great Depression, and you notice how many more people like hoarded resources, and the ways that they went about things, and you go back even sooner than that, and you go back to increasing numbers of veterans who saw really and experienced really terrible, terrible things. People who came back and PTSD wasn't like a thing yet, and so
Yeah.
you have that, and you have all this like really deep generational trauma that, for a number of different reasons, was dealt with in different ways or not as able to be dealt with. And there's scientific reasons for that, like we pointed out earlier with lobotomies and advancement of medicine. There's also like increasingly move towards radical individualism. And so there's also the aspect of like we are increasingly lonely and increasingly isolated while more connected than ever. And so in some ways, other generations, I would potentially argue, had more communal resources
Right.
to healthily process through normal wear and tear of a human, including pain. Now, we have more understanding, I think, scientifically concerning like mental illness and things along those lines. But I think generationally, too, it's easy to demonize like older generations when it comes to mental health. But I think also in some ways they like dealt with it differently. I do think there are some generational differences, particularly when you talk about like mental illness and like depression and anxiety, and a more of an understanding that like it's not only when you have experienced something really, really terrible, because sometimes the narrative you can hear is like, well, your life hasn't been that terrible. Your life has been great. So why do then you feel this way? Which is I get the question. And then
Is there something else?
I don't know.
Siri wants to weigh in
Siri
too.
wants to weigh in. And then for this generation, well, so I'm a young millennial, like barely in with millennials.
I'm barely a millennial. I'm just kidding.
Well, like it's different
No,
than
I
like
know. I'm just kidding.
like the economic crash of 2008 like was not something that I really remember, other than gas prices being really high, and I wasn't driving.
Right.
No, I wasn't yet. I had to think about that. And so I feel like increasingly with Gen Z, past millennials, people are open to talking about emotions. I feel like for me, there was still a strong narrative of big boys don't cry, especially in the circles that I was in, more of like a don't trust emotions. Guys are tough, like all very like
Right. Yeah.
hyper masculine stuff, which some of that you can trace back to like 1950s and other, there's a different discussion around gender and ideology and things along those lines. But for Gen Z, they seem increasingly open to talking about mental health. But I also wonder if now there also is like such a openness in talking about mental health that like everybody has something mental health related, which I think a lot of people do, and everybody goes through something at some time or another. But
Yeah.
also it's like, yeah, I don't know. My thoughts aren't fully formed around
Well,
Gen
yeah,
Z,
and
but
there's not like perfect answers to all of it, but I think it's really, I agree with what you were saying before, because I do think it's really easy coming from a younger generation, which I'm more millennial than you are, I guess. But I was barely driving in 2008, so there you go. But anyway, when I went through a really hard time, my family went through a really hard tragedy. My mom's age group surrounded her and loved her in a way that my age group
Wow.
did not.
Wow.
And that was a really interesting, like, generational difference of like, we're going to provide like so many more meals provided for her, so many more like check-ins, so many more like invitations for her to come and be with other people. Now, obviously, everybody has their different ways of dealing with
Sure.
grief, and whether or not that was helpful, or different things that were said, I think by all age groups can be unhelpful for sure. But for me, there was not that awareness of people in my age group of recognizing this is what you do when something bad happens.
Wow. What do you think that was?
I think it's a lot of different things, but I do think that they say that I think millennials, I think this is still true, are the most advertised to generation. And so we're jaded because of it. And so I kind of think that we are definitely one of the first generations that's had information overload from the technology and from just like how much access we have to the news, how much access we have to all of the things going on, and those instant gratifications we're talking about, and the patience of waiting. And I honestly just don't think people sit long enough with my friend is fill in the blank.
Yeah.
Whereas the community and neighborliness that is built around some of those, my mom's generation and probably the one above her as well, just like as much more attuned to I'm going to love my neighbor. Whereas like what I see in people my age that are my neighbors, like a lot of people just run inside and they don't want to talk to you in their driveway. They don't have time. They're ready to get to their thing inside their home, whatever it is. And so I do think it's affected our generation a whole lot more. Another thing that we've talked about, just you and I, a lot is this idea of FOBO. And I think that that's really prevalent in which is fear of better option. And so I think that's really prevalent in our generation and the ones below us of like, there might be something better out there because we're so attuned through social media and other things to what other people are doing at all times. Whereas like, my mom's generation, like, is like, how did you find that on the internet? Like, I'm not trying to make fun of them, but it's just not the same.
Yeah.
They still have Instagrams and all of that, but it's not the same, like, desperate, like, I need to be connected to all people at all times that I feel like we have. And because of that, you can't think of the 2 or 3 people that might actually really need your help at that time.
Yeah.
So anyway, all that to say, I do think that there were the much more like communal generational differences, whereas now we're hyper individualistic. That's really served to like isolate and make us more lonely.
Yeah, it's more like the individual's responsibility to get all the care that they need, whereas before it's like we're going to rally around each other. Like I think of my papaw, which is such a Southern grandpa name, but I think of my papaw, and he was, I think, one of 15. And so many of his siblings, like at a very young age, like passed away of sickness or were like killed in an accident or something like really horrendous. And if you listen to the stories of like your grandparents, you hear stories of your great grandparents or great great grandparents, they were surrounded by a whole lot more tragedy and pain that like was personal, that was experienced in community with one another. And so they also like, it wasn't just my burden or just your burden or my pain or your pain. It was our pain. As opposed to, I think increasingly now it's like, no, this is my pain. And so I'm going to establish my boundaries for this other person to deal properly with my pain, which I'm for boundaries. Don't hear me wrong on that. But the more communal versus individual is there was more of a shared responsibility around someone is going through something. So we're going to rally around each other and be there with one another and hold it up for each other because you are part of us. Not you exist to serve me or these things exist to serve me.
I think in that same realm, which is maybe tapping into another question that I have, but this idea that we're so connected through the internet in ways that I don't think we were ever meant to be. And so like we can still see what people from our high school are doing that like I haven't talked to in like a decade. Like, why do I need to know? You know, not in a mean way.
Sorry if you're listening. Just kidding.
But
no, but actually though, I'm with you. I'm 100% with you.
Not in a mean way, but like, are we meant to still have those connections if we're not walking out daily life with them? And and I say high school, but that's like true of all phases of life, like college, wherever you are.
Yeah.
Whereas like back, our grandparents' generation and the generation before that, like they all lived in the same town, and it
Mm-hmm.
was much more about like how can we help each other. And I see the same people, and maybe you like exist your whole life unless you move in that same community, which is very different than like now where
Yeah, that's so. So I was reading this book by Tara Isabella Burton called Strange Rites, which is about um, American religion. And one of the things that she talks about is how community has shifted uh, into affinity-based groups. And so you might make a case that community has shifted from local, meaning who lives close by, who goes to church together, who goes to school together, to affinity based. And so what that means is it's primarily geared around things that we share common interest or bond in. And so we see this in its extreme forms with the hyper radicalization of like alt right or like super, super progressive left, or really anything. But what that does for community as well is it makes it primarily geared around something that is me or something that I'm interested in. And as long as we share that, we're good. But if I have something that is different than you, then all of a sudden I feel radically isolated and incredibly alone, as opposed to a community that was made up of people who live close by, but whose experiences may be greatly different, of different ages, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different questions of life, where you come together and you don't share everything that's the same with one person, but collectively you share things in common, not just physically, but emotionally. And I think that also very much factors into mental health as well, and makes us feel increasingly lonely.
yeah, I mean, I read a book earlier this year on loneliness. It was Jenny Allen's book. I forgot exactly what it's called. Actually, it's right there.
Find your
Find Your
people.
People. And she was talking about how the 50s was when, in the 50s, when advertising became like so much more of a thing, was when the nuclear family became even a term that we use. Because the idea
So interesting.
was I can sell a lot more toasters to a if I convince people that the nuclear family is 4 people, 3 people, however many people. And so like we don't share things because we're so advertised to you need a pressure washer. You need your own lawnmower. You need your own rake. You need your own
Wow.
this. We all have it.
Uh huh.
And so we don't have to go to our neighbor. And now when you have to go to your neighbor, when you're like, oh, I'm cringing, but I really need some flour. And you might even still choose to go to the store versus ask your neighbor.
Uh huh.
Whereas before, it was really much more about this communal idea of like, well, yeah, we all take turns using said thing. We don't all need to own our own.
That's so. I mean, we literally just when we moved over Christmas, and we literally just bought a ladder because my neighbor across the street, who we still hang out with a lot, but miss living across the street from, had a bunch of ladders, and he's like, "Borrow whatever you need," and it was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the stuff we mainly had, but like it was amazing. If I needed anything like that, I could just say, "Hey,
Right.
man, can I come over and borrow your ladder?"
Right. And then you may have seen him and had a conversation with him
Yeah, all
or,
the time.
you know, while getting the ladder, which are those touch points that you need as a human. That,
Uh-huh.
like, if you just are going to your garage or whatever in this scenario, you're not necessarily having.
Hmm.
Okay, next question, which we've definitely already touched on, but how do you think technology factors into our mental health? And also, as a side note, do you have personal examples?
It definitely plays a role. I think it can give the illusion of hyperconnectedness and also make us incredibly uh, distracted and busy, and actually leads towards isolation. I don't want to demonize it because I think there's a lot of good that comes out of it. I think it can provide a lot of help for people. Like, let's say you're walking through depression or anxiety or whatever, and you don't know anybody who is, and you find somebody else online who is. There's something so comforting about seeing somebody else who is like with you in that. So there's a lot of good that comes from technology. Yeah, we also are constantly stimulated.
My dog really wants to be in here with us. Speaking of loneliness. Anyway. Yeah, I do agree with what you said that it's not inherently bad on its own. However, I do feel like it is a lot of the apps that we use are designed with you as the product in mind
Yep.
to keep you on it, to get those dopamine hits, to have you go back again and again to open this thing. A lot of times without even realizing that you opened it. Do you ever just like think about like how
Mm-hmm.
did I get here?
Uh-huh.
And so I think it definitely plays into this, like, especially now these everything is an ad. Like they use influencers now for ads instead of um paying companies a lot of times or
Mm-hmm.
like commercials necessarily anymore. There's a lot of like, hey, you can have what I have as long as you buy this product or you buy this
Sure.
makeup and you can look the way that I do, or you can have this home too if you just
Yeah.
fill in the
I have
blank.
to go through and I mean, this goes into social media in addition to technology, but unfollow people, not because they're posting anything bad, but because of what it does in me.
Mm-hmm.
Of it makes me like dive into comparison, makes me feel insecure or
Yeah.
whatever. And so sometimes I have to go through and like unfollow or mute or
Yeah. It's tough to talk about technology without talking about social media, so I guess they kind of go hand in hand. But even with like the way that we watch TV now,
mhm.
like this every single episode ends on a cliffhanger so that you will want to watch the next episode.
Sure. Yeah.
Like that is now binging is the new norm for
Uh-huh.
all of this stuff, and I'm not saying that there's not a time and a place for that, but it's addictive too. And so as
Yeah.
soon as you get into a show and you feel like you can't cut it off at one or two episodes because you have to know what happens, you have to see the next thing. It's just like at a certain point all of that content consumption and all of um the time that we're spending on
Mhm.
that, often shirking other things that could be good for us, like walking or,
Reading, working out, talking
reading,
to someone.
going to bed at a good time,
Yeah.
whatever,
But we
whatever.
don't have time, but we're on our phones are ridiculous.
Yeah.
Which also is going there often to numb. Like there's something deeper
Yes.
underneath it. Like how many
Yes.
times do you ever watch something, even the news or whatever, and there's some terrible story, and you're like, I need to watch something happy.
Yeah.
Which I'm not saying that's bad, either, but is worth noting that we do that. If you feel that like I can't do without it, that's probably an indication
Yeah.
that there is some form of addiction.
Absolutely. And it's built to be addictive.
Yes.
So not only is it like we're struggling with this addictive thing inside of us, but it's built to be that way as
Hmm.
well. So you almost can't help but be addicted to
Yeah,
it,
that's how it's made to work.
which is really, really hard.